All right, good afternoon. My thanks to so many of you for showing up again to this course on national politics. As I've mentioned to you before, my name is Michael Hall. I am a professor in the political science department here at Wichita State University. And we'll be going over the subject of elections today in American politics. And I've been asked to cover a few ground rules with you, even though we had talked about this last week. Please remember, if you are able to either silence or put on mute your cell phones. I had to remember to do this when I looked at the sheet of instructions in front of me. It'll be it'll be helpful to your neighbor if you make sure that your phone doesn't go off near them while the class is in session. While class is going, while I'm talking, for example, I can't do some of the open air discussions that I'm used to doing in many of my classes, but we do have available for people who want to ask questions a microphone right over there to your left. And if you wish to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to walk up to the microphone. I will try and make sure to address your question when I come to a break in what I'm saying, and we can address your question. What members of the audience have asked me to pass on is that if you ask a question or a comment, please try to make it brief and succinct, partly because there may be other people who are also waiting to ask questions, and I would like to try and get through as many questions that we have as quickly as possible. And if you have a mobility issue, I can accept, that you may need to stay in your seat and ask your question from there. But if you can walk up to the microphone and at least line up and keep a nice social distance, of course, between you and the other questioners, that would be appreciated. We are going to speak, I am going to speak for about an hour, and we'll take a break in the middle, and we'll take a break in the middle. I'm going to talk mostly about voting for the first hour, and then talk about specific kinds of elections like congressional elections and presidential elections after our break. And there may be also times we also get questions from email. Mr. Herdano, who's sitting up front here, may possibly ask me a question that has come in, from those of us who are watching this broadcast online. And of course, as you know, many of you, of course, already know this. Here at WSU, we do ask people to wear a mask covering and keep distant from other students in the classroom. It's the best way we know how to keep everyone safe from the coronavirus. And I'm told that I'm not necessarily needing to do this because I'm standing way up here, way distant from a lot of you, and it will be easier for a lot of people to hear me if I'm not wearing a mask. But if I interact with people during a break or after class, which I'm quite willing to do, yes, I will put my mask on and make sure that I'm following the same protocols as everyone else. So if you have a respiratory issue, that's understandable. But if you do have a mask and you can wear it, please do so. It will be appreciated by others, to be sure. Now, today, as I mentioned, we are talking about elections. And of course, this brings together a lot of different, elections themselves are really, involving, as you can see on the slides up there, really a lot of different people. It's voters, it's political parties, it's the politicians who run for office. A lot of key political actors are involved in elections. And normally when we talk about elections, or you may feel, when you've heard people talk about elections, or when teachers have talked about elections during school, you tend to get some, certain senses of elections, like we are a great democracy, the greatest democracy on the planet, because we have a system of elections where the politicians respond to what we do, and that, of course, unfortunately, turns out to be a little simplistic in many ways, because there are plenty of cases in American politics where decisions are made that are not necessarily reflective of what the majority of people would want. That's true. There's also a more cynical view, on the other hand, which argues that elections don't really seem to count for much and politicians seem to do whatever they want to do, ignoring the public. And I would like to argue with you that's not quite true either. Somewhere in the middle is the truth of the situation. I'm going to ask you today to consider instead thinking of elections as being kind of like an interactive game or a dance, where politicians definitely want something. They want to be elected, if only because they've chosen this as a career and they want to stay in that career as long as possible, or because they really do have, say, axes to grind of one reason or another. They have policies they really do want to see enacted, and they figure that working within the system is the best way to do that. And to work within the system, they need to get elected. On the other hand, you do have the voters, who are not necessarily passive and are not necessarily unreflective. Voters also want things from their politicians. Voters also think about the election and the choices they have to make. And as voters make their choices, politicians recognize voters are making their choices. So politicians have their choices to make as to how they present themselves, how they campaign. Voters in turn respond to those choices. And it's a kind of dance back and forth, one with serious implications about who wins and who loses, who gets what they want, and who doesn't get what they want. There are real implications to what we're talking about here, and ones that involve a lot of different actors all pursuing different things. So when we talk about voting, it's so I'm going to start talking about voters. When talking about voters, normally, of course, when we think about the choices voters have to make, we think, well, it's basically a choice of one of two people, and they make their decisions based on the one of two people in front of them. Please remember, of course, and it's easy when you think about it, there's another choice voters have to make that's even more subtle and in some ways just as fundamental. Am I bothering to go out to the polls at all and vote? Or do I just want to stay home and sit this one out? That too is a choice. That is a choice that voters, even people who are eligible to vote, make a choice about whether or not they're going to do that. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of research and investigation gone just into this question, which may sound a little academic, but it does actually have some crucial implications, some of which I may have to get to later. We know that turnout varies in election over time, and we know that it varies a lot depending on what state you're in. Some states like Oregon, I believe Washington as well, in the Pacific Northwest, some places in New England tend to have higher voter turnout than some other places in the United States. Interestingly enough, the place with the lowest voter turnout is the American South. And we also know that the decision to vote varies among individuals. Some groups of people come out to vote more often than others. And there's a variety of and we also know that turnout varies over time. When we talk about turnout, what are we really talking about? It's a percent. We measure this in terms of a percentage. When we talk about voter turnout, we're essentially taking the number of people who came out to vote and dividing that by the number of total people who are eligible to vote. All right. And so in a sense, if you take the entire pool of the number of people who are eligible to vote, who are allowed to vote in the United States, and then figure what percentage of them actually bothered to come out, you get a percentage, you get a number which we call voter turnout. So we can actually measure to some extent how many people came out to vote in different times and in different places. When we address the question about why voter turnout varies across different states, there's one thing above all that seems to matter a lot, because in the United States, after all, a lot of the ground rules for who can vote are, in many ways the same. As we discussed last week when we were talking about the Constitution, people are not allowed to be denied the right to vote on the basis of their race, on the basis of sex, and as long as you're 18 or older, nobody can bar you just by virtue of your age either. That being said, we do see that different peoples do come out to vote more often, and it varies across states. When in different states, part of the key reason, most of all, it seems to make a difference when we can actually measure these things and actually crunch some numbers about which states are more likely to have people come out to vote than others. It has to do with registration requirements, okay? And if you've registered to vote, you know what I'm talking about. Registration requirements. In the United States, almost every single state requires the voter to take an initiative and to fill out some kind of form identifying who they are, where their address is, how to be contacted, for example, and they file that form with their, in case of Central County, we file that form with our local county courthouse, for example, or at least all those forms end up going to the county courthouse because that's where the election officials are in this county. These requirements, like I said last week, are left really up to the states. The states can't bar people from voting on the basis of race, age, or sex, for example, but states do have a lot of discretion in telling people, when do you have to register by, for example. This could be way before the election, or it could be, in some cases, the day of the election. In fact, in Oregon, if I remember correctly, according to their laws, you can actually register the same day you go to vote. So you go to the polling place, even if you're not registered just then, you fill out your form, do it on the day, turn that in. Okay, you're registered now, then you go cast your vote. In Kansas, of course, it's not quite like that. There's a deadline before the polling day comes. And in a lot of these southern states, that deadline for registering to vote is much earlier than the election than most other states. There's a correlation here. There's a correlation here. The easier that states and counties make it to register to vote, the more people sign up to do so, and the greater number of the population that actually goes on polling day. It shows us that, once again, there's an important role for federalism here, like I talked about last week. And it also shows that states do have some real discretion in terms of encouraging or discouraging people to vote. Even when states have, for example, have the same, of course, the same rules for everybody in terms of what they have to do to register, we've also noticed as well that certain kinds of people are more likely to come out to vote than others. And you see three of the key things that determine who comes out to vote more often are actually right up there on the slide for you. One has to do with education and income. Consider, for example, in essence, people who earn higher wages or have overall more wealth on average, and tend to have more educational background, are more likely to vote than those who are poorer or who have less schooling. And this shows up no matter what state you're in. Why this happens, and this correlation we can show with statistics quite a lot. Why this happens is actually not hard to fathom when you think about it. People who have greater income may have generally had, in this society particularly, more education. More credentials don't always guarantee a higher wage. I know this from personal experience, but but for the most part, having a bachelor's or a master's will, on average, increase many people's incomes, and people with more wherewithal maybe have more time out to vote. People who are working, people who are scraping by for a living, may find that their employer really requires them to be at their job, particularly on election day, for example, and they can't afford necessarily to take off work because they're scraping by. People with higher income may be able to negotiate something a bit better with their employer. Not only that, people with more education are able to navigate the election system a lot more easily. Think about all the information it takes just to participate in voting. You have to know the rules about how to register and how to find that, for example. You need to know where your polling place is and how to navigate the website to get there. And if you don't necessarily have good internet access at home, and not everyone does, this can be very difficult to find out, even though it may be publicly available by going to the county courthouse. Let's face it, most of us look this stuff up on the internet, and if you don't have that kind of access, that can be harder for you. Also, if you're going to go vote, and that's not only just a matter of registering to vote and finding your polling place, but you've got all these different candidates. For a lot of people, this is bewildering. This is the United States, after all. We're being asked to vote not just for a president, but for a congressperson, or maybe more than one congressperson, Senate and House in some cases. We're going to be doing that later this year. There's also state races. We're not voting for a governor this year, but there are legislative races in the state, and there may be county or city elections. And for each one of those, different people are running. that may mean you're trying to find information about, say, 12, 16, 20 different people, and trying to make decisions about who you like and who you don't like and what they're talking about, for example. That takes a lot of sense of how to find out, where do you go to find that information. People with more education, on balance, can navigate all those decisions better than people who have less education. So unsurprisingly, they come out to vote more often. Age makes a difference. I'm looking at an audience who probably will not be surprised by this. In many cases, to be bluntly honest, the generation that comes out to vote most often are senior citizens. Not necessarily any surprise. In many cases, senior citizens most of all have the longest, most experience in voting. Again, they know how, they have experience in knowing how to navigate how elections work and what to do in those circumstances. Not only that, as many of you know, I mean, you're sitting here on a Wednesday afternoon. You've got time to do it. I'm under contract. I'm technically working, but a lot of you're retired. You have the time to be able to spend doing this. And having to work on election day should not really be an excuse for saying I'm not going to go and vote. In many cases, polling places are open until well into the evening, 7 or 8, in most states and counties, for example. But for those who are retired, there's not really a barrier in going as early as you like in the morning or the afternoon. And I've noticed so many times too, it's not just older people that tend to go out and vote more often. It's older people who are the ones most often manning the polling places. Those who are doing the volunteer work of keeping the polling place operating and running tend to be senior citizens because they have the time to do that. And thankfully, thank heavens, have felt a sense of civic responsibility to go out and do that kind of work. On the other hand, on the other end of the scale, the generation that votes the least are the ones I normally talk to, the younger generation. In recent years, now I want to caution people. It's not to say that younger people are completely disengaged. I end up talking to political science classes quite a lot, where I find students that show up to my political science classes are quite engaged. Very cognizant of what's going on in the news, and may come up to me after class and ask me, "Did you see this was happening? What's going on there? What's your opinion about that?" I get that. I get those questions. And I've known a number of students who are very gung ho to be political science majors. They have their own sense of civic responsibility. But when, of course, I've asked entire classes of Introduction to American Politics, how many of you voted in the last presidential election? There's always a number that say no. And the reason most of them say they hadn't voted in the last presidential election is usually obvious. They're 18 or 19 now when they're sitting in my classes. Earlier, they couldn't vote. But for some of them, this may be the first election they actually have the chance to sit in on. And for a lot of them, well, again, that's something they have to navigate. They may never have done that before. And in some cases, nobody may have shown them how, for example. Add to that I've got a lot of students, the day and age when the average college student was actually just depending on their parents' money. Yeah, some of them do that, but increasingly that's going by the wayside. Many of my students tell me about how they want, they're trying to do this work, but they have to get out of class because they're going to work somewhere. A lot of people are putting themselves to work part-time. And again, it's facing that same situation where on polling day, they may be stuck trying to do some kind of work and feeling that with classes, work, they don't have time to do looking up stuff like some of them feel they ought to do. And like I said, they don't have as much experience. In many cases, that's some of the big reasons that mean the younger people don't necessarily vote as often. That being said, so we see a pattern. Older people generally tend to go out and vote a lot more often than younger people do. And those who have a sense of what is called party identification tend to vote more often. Party identification is really a political science-y term for something that's pretty common and obvious. Some people, when they describe themselves, will say, "I'm a Republican," or "I'm a Democrat." When you self-identify when you identify yourself as belonging to a political party, that's called party identification. That's what we call that in political science. And people who've already chosen to align themselves with a political party, Republicans or Democrats, it doesn't matter which, if they've aligned themselves with a political party, and particularly if they feel strongly about that political party, you can depend on them to vote more often than most other people. There are many people today, of course, they may have their opinions about politics, but if you ask them what party they are, say, oh, I don't really belong to any party. I'm an independent. What we found is, yeah, there are a lot of people that may think about politics. They may not feel they want to identify themselves with a political party. On balance, though, they vote less often than those that do identify themselves with a party. Voter participation also rises and declines over time. And I don't, this is the part where I'd love to get out in discussion, ask question like, what do you, if you had to pick a number, how many people show up to the average presidential election, for example, I can get numbers going all over the place, and love to play that game. A lot of people might actually be surprised at some of the numbers. In some ways, though, some of the numbers. Actually, the United States in the past few presidential elections has been averaging around some 60% of voters going into presidential elections. Now, a couple of things about that. 60%, when you compare that to other major industrial economy democracies, other democracies like, say, Japan, Britain, Sweden, Italy, we end up being lower in voter turnout for our most national elections than most other countries around the world. Part of the reason goes back to that registration requirements. In the United States, remember what I said, just about every state requires the voter to go and register themselves and to figure out how that works. We're about the only country that does that. The only major democracy, I should say, that does that. Okay, put aside poor countries, developing countries, dictatorships, leave those aside. Of all the stable, highly developed democracies, we're the only ones that tell the voter, you're the one who has to go register yourselves. In fact, in just about every other major democracy in the world, it's up to the local governments or the national government to keep lists of voters. And people are registered by, the administrations of the different countries effectively drop the voter list. All the voter has to do is show up on polling day and say, I'm here, this is who I am, give me my ballot, for example. It makes it so much easier for people to go out and vote. Unsurprisingly, people go out to vote in those other countries at a much higher rate than those in the United States. Add to that a simple point. In the United States, we have a two-party system. There are many benefits and advantages to that, but you and I, if you're not one of these people or yourselves, you and I know people who are, they may say, I don't even like either political party. And sometimes that's disincentive to vote because they feel that neither party is talking about what they want to talk about or do what they want to see done. In so many of these other countries we're talking about, especially countries like Sweden, Germany, Italy, there's more than two political parties. There could be 5, 6. You don't like the two biggest parties in the country? Hey, there's some other smaller party out there that has a chance of winning something in the elections. If you got a choice of 5 or 6, chances are there's somebody out there you kind of like. Encourages people to go out and vote. That is one advantage of a multi-party system that we don't always necessarily have. But I digress. Second point about our voting rates in the United States, about 60%, it's actually been growing. And ironically, in some other major democracies, it's been declining. But the United States has actually been growing. In fact, the nadir or the lowest point of voter participation in the United States was back in 1996. Remember who was running in 1996? That was Clinton, obviously. And do you remember his opponent in 1996? It was, I think this crowd might remember. Not Bush, Dole. Your former senator, Bob Dole. He was the Republican opponent. I remember that election. It kind of came and went without many people actually noticing. The economy was doing relatively well. We had, the Cold War was over. So many things seemed to be going just on their own on autopilot that there wasn't necessarily a big debate in that particular year. We ended up with, I think, about 55% of the American public voting in that election. Interestingly enough, as time goes on, voter turnout in the United States has actually been increasing for the past several years, with a dip in 2016. In 2000, voter turnout actually did increase from its low point in 1996. But remember, in 2000, what was one of the main stories about the presidential election? That was Bush versus Gore. And how did it turn out? Razor thin. And the polls before that election told people, boy, this is really going to be a squeaker. So what happens when elections get to be competitive? People start coming out, because now 1996 was a bit lopsided. The polls all kept saying Clinton's probably going to win, Clinton's probably going to win. So a lot of people said, okay, Clinton's probably going to win. I don't have to necessarily go on this one. 2000, when it showed there was going to be a very close competitive race, more people started coming out, because there was a serious chance the candidate I like, he may lose if I don't get out there. Competitive races tend to increase turnout. 2004, 2008 also started to see more increases as well. More younger people did start coming out to vote, and more people started coming out to vote as now some big issues started to mobilize more people, especially, say, the Iraq War. And then you get to 2008. We don't just have the aftermath of the Iraq War, but a recession is coming on, for example. 2012, there starts to be, and as we get more polarized as a country, admittedly, as we get more polarized and the two parties seem to grow further and further apart, the choices between the two parties start to become a little more clearer to voters as well. As we get polarized and more people start identifying themselves as Republican or Democrat, and fewer people start saying, I'm an independent, we start to have more people coming out wanting to vote for their side. And the numbers keep going up and up and up, admittedly until about 2016. And then an odd thing happens. The two major candidates in 2016, Donald Trump, who obviously won, and Hillary Clinton, who did lose, when you asked people in the polls prior to that election, do you approve or disapprove of this candidate? Both candidates of both major parties had more disapproval than approval. I've never seen an election like that before. I've never seen an election like that before, but there was a significant section of the American public who looked at both candidates and says, I don't like either one of them. That encouraged a few more people to stay home and vote, so the numbers dipped a little bit. However, with polarization continuing, the two candidates talking about very different things on a number of, very different positions on a number of issues. Parties do seem to be getting farther apart. Again, more people seem to be lining up with different parties. And again, lots of issues in the news that seem to be galvanizing and mobilizing people. We do at least seem to have the opportunity here for an election where voter turnout may jump from at least where it was in 2016. Not, with a few big things standing in the way of increased voter turnout. A lot of them have to do with the way voting is administrated. This particular year, obviously, why most of us sitting here wearing masks? Well, obviously there's a pandemic going on. It's disrupted so much of what we normally do. The way we normally teach a class, the way we go to a grocery store and what we buy, simple acts of like going out to a restaurant and a movie have been disrupted. We all know that. That's fairly obvious. And we can see this coming. So has even the act of voting is now going to be different this year than the way it was before. Americans, for example, are those that do vote may be used to long lines to wait for a chance to get to the polling booth and cast a ballot, for example. So far so easy. Now we realize, of course, that going out to a public place and getting close to other people, may be a bit more touchy this time. And this may, of course, this may discourage some people from going out to vote, or at least going to a polling place and going out to vote. We also, going out to a polling place and going out to vote. Part of the problem we're going to have, obviously, with elections this year is that those people that would normally choose to be poll workers are facing a disturbing choice. Do I fulfill my civic responsibility and help keep democracy working, help keep the machinery of democracy working, or do I need to protect my health and make sure that I'm not, coming in close contact to one person after another, and I don't know what germs they may be carrying. I don't envy people this problem and this dilemma. But a number of counties and cities across the United States are facing the potential of having too few polling workers. Um, working on polling day. There is the prospect then that there may be long lines, and also, in addition, for an obvious reason, people are going to be encouraged to stay 2 meters, 6 feet apart, 6 feet apart, obviously. Those lines, which we normally think of being as long, will go way out the door as people try and distance themselves and waiting for a chance to vote. And the whole process of voting may be a little slower if the county is short staffed. At this point, I would like to encourage people, I understand if you feel you need to protect your health, that's perfectly understandable to do so. But if you do have a sense that maybe this is something you would like to try, or something where you can really help out your country and the machinery of democracy, please do consider getting trained to work as a poll worker this year. If you feel that you can try and keep yourself safe, I'm sure the county and many other places would love to have the help and can give you the basic training to do that. Please consider doing so, because we are facing that as a problem this year, and that may discourage people from voting, or at least it may discourage people from going to the polls as they normally do to go to vote. This is also why, of course, a lot of people would like to mail in a vote, much more socially distant. Has the prospect of allowing people to cast their vote and do so in a relatively healthy and safe manner. Here again, of course, as you've been watching the news, this is facing potential problems. Different states have different regulations on this, as well as many other things. And some states have been allowing vote by mail actually for some time. I believe Colorado has actually been doing this for many years. People have been voting by mail in that state even well before anyone ever talked about coronavirus or COVID-19. Other states, seeing pressure from their public, are trying to jury rig this year with results that we don't know, because those states are going to have to deal with different procedures of dealing with more mail-in votes. Some states, for example, some states and counties, for example, are setting up specific places where instead of dropping in the mailbox, there's a particular box you go on the road to and you drop off your ballot there. And it's supposed to, secure, locked, a locked box where you can drop off there. Other states are going to rely on the U.S. Postal Service to do that instead. But, different people are now going to be facing, well, how does it work in my particular place where I'm living, for example? There have, of course, been concerns raised about how secure the election procedure is if people are just allowed to vote by mail. At the risk of going out on a limb, a few things which we do know from research on voting, for example. First of all, mail-in voting has been done in small ways for many years. People who are in military service, for example, or people who are just working overseas have always have been, in many states and localities, been allowed to vote by absentee ballot by mail for years. This is not necessarily a brand new thing that anyone's done before. In the past, we've not seen really any major records of huge disruptions done to the electoral system just through absentee voting. That's largely for very simple reasons. The people who do often request an absentee ballot where they can vote by mail tend to be, in the past, a small portion of the American public. When they vote, the numbers that they would vote in, for example, were usually not large enough to tip the scale of an election in any sort of direction. However, it can slow down the counting. Oh, when I say this, let me rephrase that. Very oftentimes when election workers are counting votes, they'll often count the votes of that vast majority of people that voted according to the polling booths, according to the normal method. And then absentee ballots may trickle in, and then absentee ballots, they have to be in by a certain date. That's true. But it may take time to count those absentee ballots. Sometimes a person was declared a winner before all the ballots would be counted, but very oftentimes mail-in ballots would not determine the election one way or another, and if they did, it was rare that they would tip the scales in one direction or another, basically for a simple reason. The people who did absentee voting were not usually very different in their profile than most rank and file voters. So mail-in voting didn't normally tip an election in any particular sort of direction, most cases. We are facing a year, though, where things may, and for example, and also I should say, there really has been no major cases found of significant fraud, of some sort of organized effort to mail in a number of false votes of people who either are voting twice or don't deserve to vote at all. This has not gone on in the past. That anyone who are election officials or researchers in political science have ever really managed to detect. What we are facing, though, this particular year is a new situation with so many people understandably wanting to vote by mail. Due to the coronavirus, there's going to be some strains on the election system in order to do something we take for granted just about every election year. Call a winner that day of the election, for example. With so many votes normally counted somewhat electronically, this has been in the past a fairly straightforward and fast procedure. It may be a little slower this year if more people are mailing in their votes in granted. Like I said, it has to be done by a certain date to be sure, but now you have an administrative problem of just processing all those votes. It may be slower in many cases to say so-and-so won the election. Add to that a tricky political phenomenon which is unique to this particular year. It's no secret, of course, that many people who are supporters of the Republican Party are, for the most part, relatively less inclined to be concerned about, feeling that there ought to be less public meetings. Republicans, let me try and rephrase that. Republicans, by and large, do tend to agree with President Trump that we should try and get the country moving more quickly again, trying to have more public meetings as soon as possible, and engage in business as normal as soon as we can, and show, on balance, less concern with coronavirus. There's been a growing, movement among conservatives to say the rate of people who get sick from coronavirus is actually a small percentage, and that the media don't say that, don't really typify that enough. And on balance, what this means is what? Republicans, for the most part, are not necessarily all going to show up at the polling places, but they are more likely to show up at the polling places and brave these coronavirus concerns. However, Democrats, and those who are supporters of Biden is the one, after all, who's been wearing a mask in public more often than the president has. Democrats, by and large, because they have, on balance, expressed more concern about public gatherings and public health safety, are more likely to want to vote by mail. This leads to a potential of something that may happen on election day, which is that when the votes from the polling places are counted all at once on election night, it may show Republicans to have relatively higher percentages. And then as the election officials start counting those mail-in votes, that percentage that the Republicans thought they had may start to shrink over time. And then what could be a process of days, for all we know, could lead to a case where in some cases Democrats are found to have a higher percentage of votes than what people thought they saw on election night. This would not be the result of any kind of conspiracy necessarily, or some kind of underhanded process. This may be, given the way election politics is working out this year, something we have to brace ourselves for. And to simply have to allow our election officials to do their job and do it safely and properly, and maybe be content with the fact that we may not know who has won something at the presidential or other levels on election night. There is, of course, another elephant in the room, which is the question of hacking. This was found to be a problem in 2016. Our national intelligence services, and not just one, did find evidence that the various Russian groups were, at the very least, probing for weaknesses in the electronic computer defenses of a number of voting systems across the United States. And it didn't seem like any particular state was left from their hacking. There is Not so much evidence of this, but recently it was revealed that apparently some Chinese hackers were trying to gain entrance to the accounts of the email accounts and other computer accounts of the Biden campaign, for example. There are real concerns. There are real concerns, for example, about whether or not the election will be hacked by foreign governments. I don't wish to poo-poo these things, but let me say some things by way of clarification. It is true, and we have good reason to believe, I do feel we have good reason to believe, that foreign governments really are, the Russian government in particular, is behind efforts to try and undermine the security of American elections in a variety of places. They've clearly tried to hack a wide variety of states and counties. One thing that actually helps the United States is, ironically, go back to federalism. What the Russians have to do, or any foreign government has to do, is to try and hack not simply one central national election commission, because there really is none. There's a variety of states and counties that all collect votes. And so these hackers, unfortunately for them, have to do a huge amount of work in hacking thousands of county systems across the United States. This is, one thing that makes it difficult for them to do their work. So far for us, that's at least something to be comforted by, but you don't necessarily need to swing an election by hacking each and every county. What unfortunately may happen is that, unfortunately, some governments may try to undermine the election by hacking certain swing counties in swing states and targeting their hacking in certain places. That could be a concern where we may have to do some investigation about how votes were counted and how secure those elections were done in certain places in the United States. In certain places in the United States in the run up to the election and after election day. There have been several calls. To try and boost our computer defenses. It's not as if counties don't necessarily know that this is a problem. For a lot of them, this is a problem that involves how much money and time and effort they can, especially, like I said, if they're being short-staffed, how well they can actually provide computer defenses against hacking. Some things that they can do, frankly, would be simple things about making sure those who work the election systems take very basic precautions. In other cases, some serious IT work may have to be done, and money ought to be allotted for this. That is to say then that questions about voting and not voting are going to be complicated this year. And hopefully more people will at least try and brave whatever complications there are. Or even if they feel that the votes may not be counted fairly, still try and go out to vote and do it anyway to make sure voices are heard. The best way to guarantee that those working to undermine democracy win is to decide to roll over and not vote at all. I strongly feel that. Now, when voters do make choices and they decide, I am going to vote, how do voters make those calculations and decisions? I know as kind of reflex action for a lot of people to say, well, they see ads on TV. And they see the ads on TV. People who do the campaign marketing, they work their kind of magic, and it becomes a kind of mind control, and people just sort of follow what they see on the ads. Don't give the voters such short shrift. I'm always sort of struck by one thing. When people say these kinds of things, they're always thinking, well, other people are kind of sheep and they roll over when they watch a lot of TV ads. But I know, the people who are saying this, they kind of think to themselves, well, I know better. I know the issues. I know these candidates. I know other people get swayed by those things, but I don't. And it's kind of funny how we all seem to think that other people are getting swayed, by campaign ads and stuff. But we ourselves, we've thought about things. We all do this to some extent. And when you look at the campaign ads in particular, one thing you can notice is it's not mind control. It's not some sort of Madison Avenue magic. Those campaign ads are targeting what we know from research are the main things that people use to decide who they're voting for and what party they're voting for. Namely, three things come out in particular. Stances on the issues, for one. Voters decide for themselves what issues are of most concern to me, and who are the candidates whose positions are closest to mine, or who are the candidates who are doing well on certain issues. More about that in a moment. Party identification, that sense of I belong to a certain political party. Obviously, if you feel you belong to a certain political party, you're more likely to vote for the candidates of that political party. No big surprise there. And the question of character. Is this person I'm voting for judged by the voter to be a good person? And we can say a variety of things about that, but a few basic things on how voters make these calculations on all these 3 points. Excuse me. When we talk about issues in political science, obviously, this could be mind-boggling. There's all kinds of issues out there. There's issues ranging from abortion to gun control, to education, to public health and how we're dealing with the pandemic, or money spent on the military, all kinds of issues out there. We as political scientists, we don't necessarily try and go through each and every issue, but we do try and break down issues into 2 broad types. We call these positional issues and valence issues. Positional issues are where the parties may take very different positions about what they would plan to do if they were elected, what they would plan to do about that particular issue. And their position would be different than, say, many of the positions taken on the same issue by the other party. And people, when they look at these issues, they think to themselves, what position do I take? Am I pro-life or pro-choice? Do I want more gun control or more exercise of gun rights? Would I be comfortable with homosexuals marrying, or do I think we should be defending more traditional values? These are all things we call positional issues, all right? People take a position on that issue, and it could be very different. And the crucial thing here is the position they take on the issue could be very different than what somebody else takes on that issue. That is different from another set of issues, which we would call valence issues. Here, it's not so much about it's not so much about the position you're taking. Think to yourself, you've probably heard this for years. You've heard candidates saying, I'm a candidate that favors education. And they may say that strongly, talk about how they want to have good schools and, people's only line, how we need to have stronger schools. I'm in favor of education. I'm still wondering where those candidates are that are against education. I'm still waiting. I'm still looking for them. In my research, I've not found them. There are certain kinds of issues on education. Broadly, people agree we'd rather have more than less. On crime, we'd rather have less than more. On the economy, we'd rather have economic growth than stagnation or a recession. These things, are often treated as no-brainers. What's at issue here? It's not the position we take on these things. We call them valence issues because what we're trying to figure out is which party would do a better job of doing the sort of things we agree we would want to have. Who is running the schools better? Which party is running the schools better? Which party would create more economic growth for the whole economy? Which party would do a better job fighting terrorism? We agree on the goals. We don't necessarily agree on which party would do the better job administrating these things. These things matter because we can start to figure out some patterns about who wins and who loses elections by talking about how both positional issues and valence issues matter to how elections are run. Here's a chart that you've got in your handouts, and if you're watching this online, at least you can see this from the slides that I've got up here. This chart looks like one of those statistics problems you saw in a math textbook when you were younger. I realize that. What this chart really means to represent is on that horizontal axis, that arrow that goes from left to right. Imagine that is a spectrum of ideology, where people who are more liberal are on the left and people who are more conservative are on the right. And of course, we call these people left-wing and right-wing correspondingly. And those people that are more moderate being in the center, for example. What the vertical axis or that up and down arrow measures is how many people, how many voters would be where on the spectrum. So where it's big and high and fat in the middle of that curve, that's implying that lots of voters in this particular election are moderates, for example. Not every voter, but a lot of them. And there are more moderates than, say, conservatives, to the right of the moderates. And there are some people, a fewer of them, who are liberals on the left-hand side to the moderates. And each particular position on that left-right spectrum has a certain number of voters attached to it. And just for the sake of argument, we're going to say it's like one of those Gaussian curves. There's more moderates than anyone else, but there's still a sizable number of liberals and conservatives to either side. Now, what happens, for example, when you've got, say, a presidential election, where you've got, in our country, two main parties, each putting up a nominee for president, and those candidates are going to have to present themselves to the public with a certain platform. That is to say, there is a collection of issues that they want to talk about, and they're going to tell the voters, this is what I'm going to do on these issues. And we've got, just for example, we've got candidate A. That's always a dry sort of thing. We can call it, suppose it's a candidate we call Johnson. And candidate Johnson is at letter A. He's positioning himself to the public, not as quite exactly a moderate, but maybe a little liberal and just a little left to the mainstream. And suppose that's how Johnson presents himself to the public and what he's going to do. There's only so many voters who believe exactly what he does, and there are many, of course, left to the left or right of him. And suppose, however, his opponent is a Republican candidate B, call him, I don't know, Goldwater. And he presents a really hard conservative position to the American public and said, if I'm elected, I'm going to do a bunch of really conservative things on the issues. All right. We can then ask the question, well, who might win this election? Some of you, usually when I use this example in my classes, I've only got a few students that, reckon, where I'm going with this. This is the 1964 election, arguably in miniature. Johnson was a liberal, but at the time, many voters had views that were more or less, many mainstream voters did have views that more or less aligned with his. Goldwater at the time was considered to be really conservative, even compared to a lot of people at the time. Goldwater, though, ran on the belief that there was a great silent majority. And a lot of people were more secretly conservative than the pundits or the pollsters allowed. And if he just gave them a hard conservative message, they would come out and they would start voting Republican, unlike in the previous election, unlike in some of the previous elections. Well, they voted for Eisenhower, but he was a popular general. I mean, really get a lot of people to come out rallying, people around a conservative Republican message. Who would win this kind of election? Well, we actually saw this in 1964. Johnson won, and he won pretty much by a fair landslide, it turned out. Landslide, if you take it by 8, 9, or 10 percentage points or more, it wasn't even a close election. He won pretty handily, partly because of what we call the median voter hypothesis. Like I said before, there's a lot of voters there who are not exactly believing exactly what Johnson is presenting, and there's not a lot of voters who believing exactly what Goldwater is presenting. So what do? They're trying to make a decision based on what we call proximity voting. Which of these two guys is closest to my position? Even if I don't get everything I want out of either one of these two candidates, who's closer to my position than the other guy? I'll vote for that person. And when everyone who's in, all the voters that are in that red section over there, well, Johnson's clearly closer to them than Goldwater is. They end up voting on this model for Johnson. All those people in the blue section over there, they're closer to Goldwater than they are to, for Johnson, so they're voting for Goldwater. The people in gray in the middle, they'll split evenly along a line that's halfway between Johnson and Goldwater's positions. Who ends up with more votes? Well, there's more votes under the curve on Johnson's side than there is in Goldwater's. And the key to understanding the winning of elections in this case is figuring out, well, who's going to win the election? It's that candidate that's closer to the average, or what we call the median voter, the voter who's somehow midway in between, that full spectrum. Whichever candidate tends to be closer to that average voter is the one in this sort of way of thinking about elections is more likely to win. I would argue you see this at work even today in the way campaign strategies are showing up. Many of you have probably been following the Senate race we've got in Kansas this year. And while I was watching a Sunday morning program. Sunday morning programs seem to, get campaign ads coming out of the woodwork. And one campaign ad was for the Bollier campaign. Barbara Bollier, Dr. Barbara Bollier, as you probably know, is the Democratic candidate. In her ads, in one of the ads that she runs, you see certain words featured very prominently on the ad: sensible, centrist, a good moderate choice for Kansas. Or in a sense, what are we, what are we trying to do? Saying, I'm arguing for things that a lot of Kansans would. And when she's talking in her ads, the key, one of the key issues she's bringing up is high cost of medical bills. That if she would be elected, she wants to get into the Senate and work on legislation which would prevent people from being surprised by really high medical bills. And hey, in a sense, that's a valence issue. Who, unless you're working, unless you're, charging people for medical services, who wouldn't want, smaller medical bills? This is when you talk about yourself as sensible and moderate, she's pitching herself to that mainstream. Meanwhile, her opponent, the Republican, Dr. Roger Marshall, interestingly enough, also a medical doctor, he's running his own ads. And the keyword that he's running his own ads, one ad he runs features Bollier specifically. And he keeps hammering a different word over and over again: liberal. She voted on this, she voted on this about illegal immigration. She voted on this about some other kind, and she voted the liberal position on this issue, and issue. Barbara Bollier, too liberal for Kansas, paid for by Dr. Roger Marshall, et cetera, et cetera. Notice what's going on there. If Bollier can control the message about who she is and where she's positioned, she can put herself, even though she's a Democrat, and granted, this is a red state, right? We've got, no secret here, we've got more Republicans than Democrats. If a Democrat's going to win a statewide election, what does she have to do? She has to appeal not just to the people who are Democrats, but to moderates who are independents or Republicans, and bring them all together in a kind of coalition to get a majority of votes across Kansas. So she has to, her best strategy is to try and present herself as fairly moderate and sensible, hoping that the really hard liberals will at least want a Democrat more than a Republican, at least come vote for her anyway. And she might have a majority. But if Marshall can control the conversation about her and make people believe, and have people believe she's really liberal, then the average voter in Kansas is what? Generally a little more conservative, more Republican than the nation as a whole. He would have not only the people in the middle of the state, but also, to the right of state, forming probably the majority of Republican votes he needs to be elected to Senate. And he is probably still, even though Bollier is a good challenger, he's probably still the odds-on favorite to win, if only because the average voter in Kansas does tend to be a little more Republican and conservative than the average voter across the country. The median voter hypothesis still matters to some extent. But what we have noticed in election after election is, well, according to this model, if playing to the center was the only thing that mattered in winning elections, what you'd expect is that both parties would want to do this. Both parties would want to encourage people to think, my candidate's the mainstream, sensible candidate. My opponent, on the other hand, is this dangerous, radical, or reactionary on the far side of the spectrum. Don't vote for that person. You've got to vote for me. I'm in line with what most people are thinking. A couple of things have complicated this simple story about how you win elections. One has to do with party identification. This changes over time. Party identification, for a lot of people, used to be a simple matter. Party identification, we used to believe, was based around class, and it had been so ever since the New Deal. Remember the New Deal? Maybe you don't, maybe you're not that old, but remember the New Deal? The idea was that we would pit the interests of the average working class person in having a strong government, providing public policies, and providing better work conditions and more jobs against a Republican Party that was more pro-business, for example. And for a long time, and the Democrats, of course, kind of liked it that way because there are more working people than there are people in the business community. And for a long time, for example, when we talked about which party people tended to vote for, we had this sort of simple class-based model in mind of thinking about it. Every once in a while, though, in American history, we go through something called partisan realignments. There are huge sections of voters that change their allegiance from one party to another. And it may not necessarily be, by the way, all the voters all at once. It could just be certain sections of the American public that decide, I'm not voting for that party anymore. I'm going to start voting for the other party. And all it takes is maybe for a certain significant bloc to swing the elections one way or another. The process apparently seemed to start in 1968, when, interestingly enough, there were protests out in the streets, this time about Vietnam and civil rights, as you probably well remember. And there was a lot of media footage about looting, storefronts being broken, a lot of concern about rising crime rates at the time. And Nixon in 1968 starts to run on a law and order campaign background and starts encouraging more people who used to think of themselves as rank and file Democrats to think maybe we do better under Republicans in terms of defending law and order, or defending the country against what maybe seemed to be a growing menace of people out in the streets causing mayhem in their minds, for example. Parties started to shift. Nixon started encouraging people, especially conservatives in the South, to start thinking of white conservatives in the South, to start thinking that maybe their interests would be better off for a Republican Party that was talking about states' rights and law and order, as opposed to those Democrats that had pushed the civil rights legislation, which changed so much of the way life was lived in the South. White Southern conservatives who had been voting Democratic ever since the end of the Civil War and just would not vote for that party of Lincoln started rethinking their party alignments. And now, instead of the solid South being solidly Democratic, it's more solidly Republican. African Americans, on the other hand, coming out of the civil rights movement, credited the Democratic Party with serving more of their interests. And so it's not true that all African Americans are Democrats, but it is striking that about when African Americans go to the polls, about 90% of them tend to vote for the Democratic Party. And with 1980, more changes started to occur. Ronald Reagan deliberately campaigned for an evangelical vote in particular. So those people that were more highly religious started gravitating again to the Republican Party, even if they had been Democrats before under the old New Deal coalition. We started seeing in 1980 as well a kind of geographic shift. Democrats tended to play much better in cities, and Republicans doing much better in rural areas. You see this in Kansas really very, very easily. Granted, many people in Wichita are Republicans, but we've all seen this. If you drive 30, 40 miles out in any direction from Wichita, you start to notice things about the billboards and about and more billboards way out in the countryside talking about how awful a thing abortion is. And do you know Jesus, for example? And more of the billboards, if they say things, I've seen a few Ballier Democrat billboards up in rural areas, but far more Republican posters than Democratic posters out in the countryside. And Republicans have been trying to work more to appeal to maybe conservative ideology among white working class voters, to take that old New Deal coalition of working class people and start taking it apart. And start encouraging people to say, hey, did you lose your job to foreign competition? Are you concerned about immigrants coming into this country, for example? We have strong stances against that. And whereas the Democrats used to play well with working class people on the basis of, say, wages, jobs, working conditions, Republicans have been appealing to conservative ideology among some working class people, especially when they're white, and pulling them more into the Republican Party. Trump in particular apparently has done quite well at doing this, and I think this is one reason why he's transformed the Republican Party and its stances on things. I know a break's coming up. I'll just say a few more words. I can go over this next slide a bit quickly and then, entertain some questions, or go for, well, we may need a break at first, but let me just a few more things. Valence issues, these often have a very straightforward effect on elections, one that should not surprise any of us. The incumbent party or the incumbent politicians, those who are already in office, or the party that already controls a certain office, be it usually the presidency, or in the case of a state, the governor, when the economy does well, the incumbent party generally does better in the election. And when the economy starts to perform poorly, the incumbent, a lot of people say, well, things aren't going well with the economy. It must be whoever's in charge some way, somehow. Let's kick them out, try and give somebody else a chance. And when the economy does poorly, incumbents tend to do less well. At the presidential election, at the level of presidential elections, wars can also determine outcomes. We saw this in 1968. By 1968, public opinion started shifting away from support of the Vietnam War for the first time. And unfortunately for Johnson, he saw the handwriting on the wall. Even though the economy was doing well, inflation was going up, but the economy was overall doing well. He understood the big issue was Vietnam, and public opinion was turning away from him. Even though he was eligible for a second term, he decided not to run in 1968. And the Iraq War. In 2008, not only was there a recession going on, which was bad for the incumbent Republicans, but with the Iraq War, again, getting less and less support by public opinion, the Republican Party had a hard time campaigning for votes, and more people were willing to take a chance on a relatively less known Democratic candidate, Barack Obama, feeling that the incumbent party was maybe not handling things in the war very well. When the national economy is not doing well, or wars tend to have a lot of high fatalities and a failure to achieve goals, incumbent parties tend to do poorly. That means to say then that with this upcoming election, this is why, after all, Biden is still the odds-on favorite. Trump could still win. No denying that. Trump has a chance of winning. But Biden is the odds-on favorite if based on past experience, and I know that's pregnant with all kinds of things that can go wrong, but based on past experience, when the economy, we're not involved in a major foreign war. That's true. And that works in Trump's favor. But when the economy is not doing well, and the economy is slowly improving, that's true, but we are still at about 8% unemployment last I checked. When the economy is not doing so well, and a president in addition to that has overall bad approval ratings, it should not be a surprise that he is behind in the polls and, on balance, looking to be the one who might lose the election. After all, Jimmy Carter had a bad economy to deal with and an Iranian hostage crisis, a bad economy to deal with and low poll numbers. He became a one-term president. George H.W. Bush, by 1992, had only just come out of bad economy, but a lot of people still thought the economy was growing too slowly, and was facing not one but two challengers. To his. He also turned out to be a one-term president. If Trump loses, it should not, in fact, necessarily surprise people, because if past experience is anything to go by, it is possible. Many of our presidents who've already had one term tend to have incumbent advantages and go on to a second term. But there have been some one-term presidents, usually in times of what is considered to be some kind of national crisis, when the valence issues are not working in their favor. This could easily be one of them. And the result may, if Trump loses, it is not necessarily a surprise. Then there's also questions of character. Again, this is, a lot of people also want to judge candidates not just based on which party they belong to and what issues they have and what issue stances they have, but on the sense of being a person. Here again, there's really, if you think about it, lots of ways that we could talk about character. One thing that I think we don't do enough time doing is talking about how different candidates make decisions about, well, what sort of thought process do these people go through? What can we know about how they administrate things? One of the interesting things about Trump is that most people in the country got a chance to see how he manages things. There was a whole TV show about him managing a company, The Apprentice, and we got to see his management style. As interesting as I think those kinds of questions are about character, what we've seen from research and what voters tend to think about more, again, are really two questions in particular: the integrity of the candidate and the competence of the candidate. Namely, when this person is telling me I'm going out and do these things when elected, do they have the integrity to back that up? Because a lot of people have a cynical view and say, well, if that person's telling me they'll do this, how do I know they're going to do it? People also estimate the integrity of the character of them to get a sense of, will they really go out and do the things they're saying they're going to do? Otherwise, they can talk a lot about positions, but it may not amount to much if voters don't think they're people of integrity. And then there's a matter of competence. Do these people seem to make a lot of gaffes when they talk, when they present themselves? when they seem to be managing things if they're incumbents, or do they, or they seem to be performing their job at least professionally well. These things matter most of all when people talk about character, they're often talking about moral character more than anything else. We could talk about character in different ways, but this is the way most people do. Um, I realize I've gone on a long time enough. I ended up talking more about difficulties of voting than I thought I would today, but I thought there was a lot that needed to be said. Why don't we take a break for about 10 minutes? I'll wrap up some things about what I'm going to say this after 10 minutes, and we'll talk more about specific things about congressional and presidential elections. All right. I think we've had about 10 minutes. I hope everyone's had a chance to refresh themselves, get something to drink. I know I had a chance to get something to drink. Helped me. So I'm glad to see, I'm also heartened to see that a lot of people are talking with one another. Even though we need social distance, I mean, it's good to see people interacting with one another. I think that helps keep the vitality of the class going. We've had a couple of questions. I've had a number of people come up to me asking questions during the break. I don't have time to share everything that I've been asked. However, two things I do need to address. One is a question that came in over email. And really, it's a question that addresses something I talked about last week, which was the Constitution. The student asked, "How does the Constitution apply to legal immigrants and illegal aliens?" Um, it's fairly straightforward. Basically, what the Constitution has to say about this question of immigration and legal and illegality would be what is there in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Remember, I talked last week about equality under law with the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment also is where we get some of our basic law about citizenship. Remember, the 14th Amendment was passed just right after the Civil War. And so the question was about how we were going to make sure that former slaves would be treated equally. And it does have question. I talked about this last week. The 14th Amendment says that everyone needs to be treated with proper due process under law, and that all citizens need to have equal protection of the law. So to say the laws have to be written in such a way that it applies to everyone equally, unless there's certain compelling reasons. Different people should be treated differently under law. People with visual impairments can't necessarily get a driver's license, but that's for public safety concerns, for example, or young children like my son won't be able to drive. It's not discrimination. There's a public safety issue. The 14th Amendment also tried to prevent particularly ex-Confederate states from trying to do a dodge about treating people equally under the law. The people who drew up the 14th Amendment understood that what Southern states might do and say, well, of course the laws are going to be different for these people. They're not really citizens. And of course, these people might not really be citizens, would be those ex-slaves. So to prevent that from happening, what was written into the 14th Amendment was, at the very beginning, a definition of citizenship, or at least a very basic definition of citizenship, that all people born in the United States are citizens of the United States. That meant huge numbers of ex-slaves would be declared citizens by the Constitution just by virtue of the 14th Amendment. But it also goes on, but the 14th Amendment also goes on to say not only those people born in the United States, but all naturalized citizens. That, in effect, left it up to Congress to decide what a process of naturalization is to allow people who are immigrants to become citizens of the United States. And we do have such federal laws which define how the process of naturalization occurs, that even if you weren't born here, you can go through this process of naturalization and become a citizen. The 14th Amendment allows for that kind of process to happen. If people have not gone through that kind of legal process or were not born in the United States, they are not automatically citizens. And if they have not necessarily followed that procedure of naturalization, they can be declared to be an illegal immigrant. They can be an illegal alien. So far, so simple, but that is basically where the 14th Amendment addresses this question, and that is really what there is in the Constitution to address these questions. Most of the questions about legality or illegality of immigrants and what to do about illegal aliens are defined under congressional law, and to some extent can be defined through a presidential executive order, executive orders being orders that the president gives to those administrating the law in the executive branch. That's where a lot of it is. But the Constitution says certain basic things that's basically enshrined in the 14th Amendment and provides a kind of floor for a lot of the congressional laws. That's the best answer I can give to that question. I was also asked by one person came up to me during break if I can address the Electoral College. We'll see, because I ended up running a little longer on voting than I expected to. And I will talk about congressional and presidential elections. There's a lot to say about presidential elections, especially this year. But I'll see what I can, because I was asked specifically about the Electoral College, I can try and address, I'll try if I have time at the end to address those questions. Because I think the questions that were asked about why the Electoral College may differ from the popular vote, is there a possibility of getting rid of the Electoral College? Is there a possibility of getting rid of the Electoral College? And what would that do if we did? I understand that's more than just one person's question. There's actually a number of people I've known from other classes have interest in that question. I've actually got one student, very first day of class in Introduction to American Politics this year, said if I were elected, I'd get rid of the Electoral College, for example. And so I know this is more than just one person's concern. But let me go on to more things about elections. When reviewing some of the things I've talked about before, that some of the keys, some of the things that voters are concerned about, but when they boil down the decisions about who I choose to elect, for example, voters come down to three things: issues, party identification, and the character of the candidate. This means that certain things, to sum up and to review, become keys to elections. And politicians, when they campaign for office, often try to emphasize these points, knowing that elections could be decided, their careers could be decided based on some of these things that voters are taking to heart and making crucial to their decisions. There are a lot of people, for example, and it's not always well known, but by the time election day comes, there are a number of people in the country who are treating the election kind of like the way they treat their taxes. They're trying to do it at the last minute. There's a certain section of the American public, when deciding who they're going to vote for, wait to the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign to finally get serious about researching candidates and make final decisions about who they like and who they don't like. It turns out, however, that portion of the American public that's waiting to the last 2 or 3 weeks to make their decision is a minority of the American public and a minority electorate. One of the interesting things is most of the people who are going to vote in an election have made up their minds about a candidate several weeks ahead of time. Let's admit it. Many of you, I'm sure a lot of you probably are planning to vote. Many of you have probably already decided, full well, if you're going to back Trump or Biden, Marshall or Bollier, any other names around the list. Many of you, and a lot of this will be about party identification. I voted for this party. I like this party. These are the people who belong, these are the candidates who belong to this party. I'm going to vote for them. Roughly about two-thirds, maybe 3/4 of the American voters actually fall into this category. They know who they're going to vote for prior to an election. It's going to take something major to happen, or very unlikely that somebody will shift their vote. Nevertheless, even if most people have a sense of knowing how they're going to vote, a lot of those votes are going to split. Those people who know who they're running for will split roughly equally, or if it's a red or blue state, may vote predominantly one side or the other in a predominantly blue state. There's still, even if the people who make up that 15 to 25% that haven't made up their minds yet are only a small fraction, it could be a pivotal fraction of the American public who, once they make their minds up, may finally swing the election in one direction or another. That's what we call swing voters, and that's why they can still be important to elections. They don't have to be very numerous. If the swing voters who can be persuaded are right in the middle of that spectrum and can put one party over that 50% threshold of voters, then those swing voters, even though small, can actually decide elections. That being said, it goes back to something I mentioned before. You would think then that in pursuing swing voters, both parties would try and gravitate towards the center in how they pitch themselves towards people. And if anything, and we have actual voting records of Congress people to show this, the voting records of Congress people show that the candidates in both parties seem to be growing farther and farther apart. It's not your imagination. Voting records in Congress show that Republicans and Democrats are literally voting with each other less and less over time. And so they are actually pulling away from each other, and to some extent actually not pursuing a policy of engaging and trying to persuade swing voters in some cases. Why is that? I think the best answer to this was actually provided by one of my professors when I was in graduate school and a couple of associates of his, Jim Adams and a couple of other people named Groffman and Merrill, had noted that in that old median voter hypothesis bell curve that I showed you earlier, there's an assumption being made there that just about everybody is going to go out to vote and everybody's equally likely to vote. Well, what if that wasn't true? What if people on the far sides of that spectrum were facing their own choice? Not who am I going to vote for? There are plenty of conservative Republicans who would never ever think of voting for a Biden, a Hillary Clinton, or a Pelosi. And there are plenty of hardline liberals and Democrats who would never think about voting for Trump or Marshall, for example. The choice for them is not which candidate I'm going to vote for, but they are facing a choice. Am I going to go out and support my usual candidate, or do I just stay home? And usually for these people of strong ideological opinions and strong party identification, what they want to see from a candidate is not moderation. They want to see a good, hard, red meat message of being strongly conservative or strongly liberal, for example. And this is when candidates present that kind of message to the sort of voters that make up the key base of the party, this is called turning out the base. If it's a straight out fight, not so much to appeal to the swing voter, but if one party can pull out more of the people who are the base of their party, that is to say, the strong ideologues in the Republicans, the more the Republicans can encourage strong, hard, traditional Republicans and conservatives to come out to vote. And if it's a fight between them and the Democrats pulling out more of their liberals and traditional Democrats pulling out to vote, it becomes a question of which party can mobilize its base of support more. And Adams, Merrill, and Groffman started to notice that this can also swing elections. It is possible, if you redo that median voter model, that if one candidate gravitates too close to the center, yeah, they will encourage more swing voters to vote for them. But if they alienate the party base, if they get to be so moderate that the really hard liberals in the Democratic Party or the really hard conservatives in the Republican Party think, this guy is just too wishy-washy for me, or just trying to appeal to the party to my like and not really giving me the message I want to hear, they may stay home. And I think what we've seen as politics is polarized is that more and more, many candidates are trying a turn out the base strategy rather than a swing voter strategy. I don't think the swing voter strategy is dead. I think you could see that in the Senate race ads, like I said. But I noticed also in some other ads, especially during the primaries, when different Republicans, Marshall, blanking on names, Bob Hamilton, Kobach, thank you. I was blanking on his name for some reason. Kobach and others were all competing for the Republican nomination. These ads over and over, I noticed, were all about the same thing. Who was a real conservative and who was not a real conservative? Who was pro-life and abortion and pro-gun rights? Over and over again, they all pretty much were arguing very similar kinds of issues, but they were trying to emphasize who could turn out the base of vote and serve that base more. And that's become a very important strategy to the Republican Party. Some people have wondered, well, why isn't Trump trying to maybe make himself sound more popular or increase these approval ratings? He won the 2016 election in part by appealing very hard to his conservative base to some extent and rallying them to come out. Hillary Clinton arguably did do, given that she won the popular vote, did maybe do a better job of appealing to swing voters. But a number of African Americans and hardline liberals wondered about her credentials in serving some more liberal causes. And maybe she lost, in a sense, on her left flank while she was appealing to a broader base of support across the country. There's a possibility there that Trump won the turnout the base contest, and that was part of what proved decisive in 2016, or at least an argument could be made about that. And like I said, other keys to elections: how well is the economy doing? Are we at war for a presidential election? And questions about the integrity and competence of the character of the candidates. Notice that both sides, Trump and Biden, are trading any number of barbs against each other about the integrity and competence of the other candidate. These things, of course, these things come up in elections all the time because they're part of the keys to who wins. Now, if you want to talk, and I can talk about different kinds of elections and about certain specific things that apply to certain kinds of elections. If you were to ask, well, who wins congressional elections, and who wins congressional elections and how those work in particular, there's very simple answer to that. And it's not so much an answer about how Republicans win or Democrats win. The person who tends to win most often in congressional races is very simple. It's the incumbent. The incumbent, as I mentioned before, is that candidate who currently holds office. And it almost quite literally does not matter which party the incumbent is. If you are already in office, chances are you're going to get elected again. Not always. There are exceptions. And if we wanted to go around the room and think of exceptions, yes, there are plenty of cases. Some incumbents, sometimes high-profile incumbents, have lost their elections. And have lost elections. But on balance, there's advantages to being the incumbent. It turns out that when an incumbent politician runs again for re-election in either a Senate race or a House representative race, they have a 90% chance of winning of that. That is strikingly high. Now, I do want to underline something when I mention that. This number can change over time. There is some sense that the number is starting to drop from 90%, but in the past several elections, many Congress people have had a really good chance of getting elected. And none of this means, however, well, it means a couple of things. Number one, it actually does not mean that the same party keeps control of Congress over time. It actually doesn't. Because suppose, just for the sake of example, that we have all 435 members of the House of Representatives running for re-election. That doesn't always happen because some people do die, retire, or decide they just don't want to run again. Not everybody runs for re-election, but the vast majority of them do run for re-election. And even if all of them were running for re-election, and suppose 90% of them get into office, what does that mean? 90% out of 435 get back into office, but about 42, 43 of them would lose, all right? That could be significant because the difference between, say, Democrats and Republicans is, and difference in terms of how many Democrats there are and how many Republicans there are could easily be a margin of 30 or 20 different representatives. Even if 40 of them who are incumbents lose, that could be enough of a shift to cause, say, a Republican-dominated House to swing to the Democrats or a Democratic House swing to the Republicans. So even if it's true that 90% of the time an incumbent wins, we have seen changes in who controls the House of Representatives. We saw it not too long ago in 2018. A Republican-dominated House ended up going to the Democrats. Republican-dominated House went to the Democrats in 2010 under Barack Obama. A Democratic-controlled House ended up going to the Republicans back in 2006 when the Iraq War was starting to become unpopular. It switched from Republican control to Democratic control. Within our lifetime, we've already seen 3 big switches of the House representative switch in terms of which party controls that, even though incumbents tend to get reelected over and over again. What it does mean for us in many ways is that there is a kind of numbing sameness, a sense that the political class in Washington never seems to change that much, because even with party control shifting back and forth, there is this sense of, yeah, I know who Pat Roberts is. He's been my senator since forever. Or I know who my congressperson is. They've been around for a long time. And there is a kind of danger here, potentially, because democracy, like free markets, thrives on competition. And to the extent that elections are not competitive, there can be the sense of things not changing. Not necessarily in terms of which party controls Congress, but things not changing in terms of who's in there and how things are getting done. That is what the upshot of this means for us. There's a bunch of reasons why incumbents have such a huge advantage in congressional elections, both in the House and the Senate. And by the way, what I've said about the House changing control doesn't necessarily apply to the Senate, because senators, as you probably know, have 6-year terms. House representatives have to be elected every 2 years. They are no sooner elected, they are really campaigning for office yet again, because they know they're going to be up in 2 years' time. They need to start gathering money, start connecting with the voters over and over again, because it's not going to be long before they're elected again. Senators have it a little easier. Once they're elected, they can do their own thing for a while and then wait a few years before the voters remember, that they have to elect or re-elect that person again. Senate elections, though, are staggered. Only 1/3 of senators are elected at any given 2-year interval. So we have a Senate election coming up this year in Kansas. We have one coming up in Kansas, but 2 years from now, it will not be that Senate seat that we're electing, because whoever gets elected, Marshall or Ballier, they'll have a 6-year term. 2 years from now, it'll be a different third of Senate, which will be up for election, and their terms are staggered in such a way that there's a kind of continual re-election process going on for the Senate. Senate can also change hands from one party to another, but the margins are slimmer. But the margins are slimmer. Right now, the Republicans, I think, only have 52 senators. That's not much of a margin that they have over the Democrats. Much of a margin that they have over the Democrats, but still, it's with staggered elections, only a third of the Senate can change at any given time. Change is a little slower to come to the Senate for those reasons. I go back to my last question, why is there an incumbent advantage? There's a bunch of reasons for this, some of which you may already know of maybe having tried to deal with your own congresspeople. Okay. The advantages are on the left. For a lot of people who are donating money to candidates, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And this also gets to another thing on the list, name recognition. It matters to who gets money and who gets votes. Like I said, for many people, if they do know who their congressperson is, or they do know who their senator is, that person is at least a name brand that they recognize. Voters do have qualms about voting for a name that they've not seen before. Incumbents, especially if they've been in a long time, have easy name recognition, and they've had a lot of experience in gathering funds from certain groups that tend to give money to their political party. Challengers, on the other hand, because they're an unknown quantity, tend to have a harder time to gather money and to make their names known to the voter. There is also something called service strategy. What is that? If you've ever written a letter to your congressman asking for a favor, okay? I used to be an intern for I think I mentioned I was an intern for my congressman. I mentioned that last week. Representative Jack Murtha of the predominantly Westmoreland County district of Western Pennsylvania. Back in 1989, I was an intern. We used to get requests in. Part of what they assigned interns do in our office was to handle a lot of mail coming in. We got a lot of requests. We're going to come visit Washington, D.C. Can we get tickets to go visit the White House, for example? You can ask your congressperson that, and they know the White House office to contact for tickets to be able to have a tour of the White House, for example. I've actually had a student just recently said that she wants to go to West Point. To go to West Point, what do you need? You need a congressperson to recommend you. Her congressperson in turn said, we would like you to have a professor or somebody recommend you to us. So you get our recommendation to West Point. So I'm going to, in the next couple of weeks, write a letter for her to go to a congressperson. Or some people, their request is pretty simple. I'd like to have a flag that's flown over the Capitol. Apparently congresspeople get, at least this was true years ago. I don't know if it's still true. A lot of people apparently write in asking for a flag that's flown over the Capitol. And I think they're imagining like the very dome of the Capitol. What Congress has budgeted a little bit of money for, or at least they did a long time ago. I saw this about 30 years ago on TV. There were a couple of guys who spent their time at a flagpole. They would run the flag up the pole, leave it there for 30 seconds, bring it down, send it off to be packaged, run another flag up the pole, and keep doing this over time so that there was a constant, steady supply of flags that senators and congresspeople could honestly say had flown over the Capitol and send out to constituents. Your tax dollars at work. all kinds of things like this, or requests for information under the freedom. I don't know how many letters we got under the 1974 Freedom of Information Act. I would like, I can request this information. Could you please provide this? And sometimes I'd have to do research and provide the answer to somebody's question about government, for example. This is service strategy. And what's crucial about this is an incumbent can do these favors for voters. And a lot of incumbents do this for an obvious reason. An incumbent might say to themselves, sending out flags, providing tickets, this is all trivial stuff. I don't want to be bothered with this kind of thing. Well, if you let that go, what happens? If a person was willing to write in to their congressman and spend their time doing that, what else do you think that they're willing to spend their time doing? Voting. And if they got ticked off because they were ignored by the representative, guess what they're going to do? Go in and vote against them. Build up enough voters who have resentment, you could be out of office. So what do a lot of Congress people do? They often do these little favors, if they can, if they're reasonable, for their constituents. Can challengers do this? No, they're not in office. They can't use the office to do these things for voters. That means they don't build those connections with voters like incumbents do. Gerrymandering, this of course is a matter for the House representatives and not the Senate. But state legislatures, normally in most states, are the ones that decide exactly what the boundaries are going to be for the districts of who elects people to the House of Representatives. Gerrymandering does not affect the Senate for an obvious reason. Nobody is redrawing state lines every 10 years, thank heaven. But we do after every census, and that's why one of the many reasons this census is important this year, is that we are going to use it in the years to come to draw how many House districts we have and exactly where the boundaries are for that district in that state. And a state legislature will often, in many states, do that process. A few states don't do that, but it's the state legislature. And of course, the state legislatures are run by whom? The dominant party of that state. And so what does that dominant party do? They draw the lines very frequently in such a way that a seat is safe for their particular party, and that there are more voters in a bunch of districts for their party that can easily get somebody from their party elected. Incumbents, of course, often sit on committees. And, for example, in Kansas, surprise, surprise, we end up with senators and representatives who frequently sit on the Agriculture Committee or the Aviation Committee. Why is that? Well, they know full well what some of the key industries are here and who are the people who work those jobs in that industry. So if if a candidate's been known for, working those committees, they have an advantage in saying, hey, this is what I did for you, the voters of my state or district. And sometimes, of course, they can arrange to have money from the federal government spent on projects in that particular district. For example, this is called pork barrel spending. We hate it when we hear of some senator or representative doing that for some other kind of district. And then when our own congressperson comes to us and say, hey, we got money coming here, that's of course we of course love that person for doing their job and for, having our tax money come back to us. Pork barrel spending, for example. Incumbents can lose, though, for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes it could be something like personal misconduct. The most glaring case of this, of course, was in Alabama a few years ago. Alabama's a red state, no secret there. Lots more Republicans than Democrats. And former Judge Roy Moore looked like a shoo-in to be able to win the Senate seat in Alabama a few years ago. Until there were certain news reports that came out about an unhealthy interest he seems to have had in numerous underage teenage girls. Many of which were judged by the voters of Alabama to be credible. What looked like at first to be an obvious win for the Republicans turned into a loss, and the Democratic candidate, Doug Jones, ended up winning that race, largely due to allegations of personal misconduct against Judge Moore. But his is just one of many examples of where, if a candidate is seen to be lacking in character, they could lose even in a state where most voters share their voter identification. There are times when senators and representatives make a vote in Congress thinking, oh, this is the kind of thing my constituents would want, and then find out that they touched the third rail of an issue that they didn't realize, or it's tied in with what's last, their disruptive issues. a congressperson or senator may think, oh, I know how I go on this photo, should vote along this kind of issue, and not realize that even though the senator or representative thinks it's an easy call to vote on one thing, the voters are now wanting to talk about some kind of different issue that they're not used to talking about. And suddenly it's become a big issue as far as many of those voters are concerned, or the voters now have a position that's changed from what the incumbents were so used to figuring that their constituents had. If they touch the third rail, for example, on a difficult issue, they can end up creating a campaign issue that causes them to cost the election. We've also seen, and this is a regular pattern, it doesn't hold every single time and it doesn't hold as strongly every single case, but the president's party generally loses votes during midterm elections. Those are those elections that are held 2 years into a presidential term, midway between the two presidential election cycles. And it doesn't matter what party the president is. Republican presidents tend to see Republicans getting less votes in midterm elections for Congress, and Democratic presidents tend to see less votes for Democratic candidates during Democratic elections. Notice a number of those cases where I said the control of House of Representatives changed hands. A Republican president, George Bush, saw his party lose control of the House of Representatives when he was sitting in office as a Republican president. Barack Obama in 2010 saw his party, the Democrats, lose control of the House of Representatives when he was in control in 2010. Same thing with President Trump. There seems to be a kind of reaction that sets in 2 years into a president's term where people start to get dissatisfied with the president and they take it out on his party in the congressional elections. Different for different presidents at different times, but that's been a consistent pattern in a lot of congressional elections, and more than one congressperson has come out the wrong end of this. Presidential elections. Presidential elections. Let me go back. Actually, I'll leave this up for you in case you wanted to see it. But I had a few questions about the Electoral College. As many of you probably know, we live in a country where it is actually not true that the presidential candidate who gets the most votes nationwide is the one who wins office. And that is because of the Constitution of the United States. Strictly speaking, we do not elect a president through a national popular vote, because it doesn't say that we do that in the Constitution. It says that we elect them through an electoral college. How does that work? The simplest way I know to explain the Electoral College is to think of it as 50 different presidential elections run all at the same time. Or in effect, each state should be thought of as running its own presidential election in a presidential election year. And what is up for grabs is normally all of the electoral votes of that particular state. How do we calculate how many Electoral College votes a state gets? It is simply the total number of senators and House representatives that state has. Okay? Now, House representatives are apportioned among different states according to the census. States with larger populations get more representatives, so in turn, they also get more Electoral College votes. California, Texas, Florida have more population, are the three states which I believe still have more population than other states, so they have more Electoral College votes. Every state has at least one representative. It doesn't matter how small their population is, but even Alaska, even Wyoming, with their small populations, when sometimes you can drive through the state, look around and say, where is everybody? They have at least, there are obviously people there, but they have one representative. Add to that, there are 2 senators. Each state has at least 3 Electoral College votes. What that means is, and most states also have a rule. It's called a unit rule. And that means all of the Electoral College votes in that state will go to the one candidate that won more votes than any other candidate. Notice the way I phrased that. So even if a person wins just a plurality, or say more votes than anyone else in that state, not even necessarily majority, they may get all of the Electoral College votes. Even though they're getting 100% of the Electoral College votes, they may not have got, all of the, even close to 100% of the vote in that state. There's only 2 states that don't use this unit rule. That is Maine and Nebraska. Every other state awards all of the Electoral College votes to the one that won the most votes in that state. And so what that means is, even if a candidate, say like Donald Trump, gets a razor-thin margin of the vote, winning, say, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, he ends up with all the Electoral College votes. Hillary Clinton, when she ran in 2016, did rack up lots of votes across the country, but a lot of those votes were concentrated in states that, frankly, she was very likely to win. She got lots of votes from California, but even if she had won by a razor-thin margin, she would have got all those Electoral College votes anyway. Add to this another feature of our politics nowadays. Go back to something simple but important that I said. Democrats tend to do well in urban areas, and Republicans tend to do well in rural areas. That means states with low populations based on a more agricultural economy, Kansas being one of them, tend to vote very Republican, but they may get but they also get Electoral College votes not in proportion to their population, but thanks to those 2 senators, every small state has 3, 4, 5. This adds up. Small states that vote tend to be red states, that tend to be Republican, have, proportionally speaking, a good fair bit of the Electoral College votes. So if a Republican candidate like Donald Trump gets these small red states very easily and razor-thin margins in some of the bigger swing states, he can still win the Electoral College, racking up votes that way, even if he didn't win the national popular vote. It is conceivably possible that if President Trump does squeak out victories in, say, the states he won before, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, this could happen yet again, all right? And it ties in with what's been the patterns we see in the Electoral College in 1980. Republicans tend to do well in those states that tend to have smaller populations, more rural areas. South, like I said before, also has a lot of white conservatives that switched over to the Republican Party. Rocky Mountain states, Great Plains states, they tend to be what we call the red states that vote consistently Republican. Democrats are more likely to be strong in those states, especially those that have high urban concentrations, like West Coast states do. New England, they tend to do well, and those Great Lakes states, Wisconsin notwithstanding in 2016, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa have tended more Democratic, although Iowa's a bit more purple and swings a bit more. The states that tend to go back and forth and often do a lot of the deciding in presidential elections are your mid-Atlantic states. That strip in the middle of the Atlantic, Pennsylvania, Ohio, not Indiana, that's pretty Republican, but Illinois. Those mid-Atlantic states, which actually have a fair bit of Electoral College votes, they can swing. Florida swings. And Colorado and Mexico, thanks to bringing in a lot of people from out of state, a lot of people from West Coast states that thought it'd be a nice place, that thought that Colorado and New Mexico would be nice places to retire or nice places to do business, have turned those otherwise Republican states into more of a swing state over time. Virginia and North Carolina used to be reliably Republican. As more people have moved into Virginia and North Carolina from out of state, those have started to become a little more swing as well. These are the states where, if you notice, presidential candidates tend to show up over and over again, okay? So when the September 11th commemorations happened just a few days ago, where were Trump and Biden? Not in New York City, because New York and New York City, that's pretty reliably Democratic. Not in Washington, D.C., that's pretty reliably Democratic as well. They showed up in Somerset, Pennsylvania, where Flight 97 went down, because Western Pennsylvania is what? That's the one part of the state which is purple. Philadelphia, big city, is very blue. Matching that is all those votes in the center of Pennsylvania, which is very red. And that western part of the state, where I come from, is the one that can go back and forth. And so September 11th comes along. Where do Trump and Biden show up? Bang, in western Pennsylvania. That's where they want to commemorate 9/11 and show themselves to voters, because they know that's a swing part of a swing state, and they want to make sure they show up there. And where did they go after that? Not recently. Both of them were in Florida. Surprise, surprise. Should you be expecting them to come to Kansas anytime soon? I'm sorry to disappoint you. If you're hoping for this, no, not likely. It's those swing states that attract a lot of the campaign visits for these reasons. I was asked, and I know I've got a few minutes left, and I know you've got things to do, but I was asked midway through the class, what would happen if we got rid of the Electoral College? Okay, because some people do feel that the Electoral College, if we end up with a presidential candidate who didn't win the national popular vote, isn't there something unfair about that? We could switch to this system of national popular vote. It might mean that it would mean that in presidential campaigns, the swing states might get fewer visits than all the attention they tend to get. That would start to change. There might be a greater reliance, alas, on television and internet advertising to campaign for votes all across the nation and do it that way. One of my fellow professors, now retired, Mel Kahn, whom some of you may know, he was a big advocate for the Electoral College. He was worried that if we start nationalizing elections like they were basing it on national popular votes, that if just one part of the country had trouble counting their votes on election night, the whole country might be paralyzed in waiting for them to, report their votes. However, when a swing state like Florida took a long time to report its votes in 2000, that held the whole country captive as well in terms of waiting to see who is president as well. If we got rid of the Electoral College, there might be some benefits to that, and some people might argue it's more democratic. But what would it take to get rid of the Electoral College? Well, like I said, the Electoral College is founded where? It's in the Constitution. How do we change the Constitution? Well, 2/3 of both houses of Congress would have to propose an amendment, or we have a whole other constitutional convention to propose an amendment like that. And then it goes where? It goes to the states. And to make it official and to ratify an amendment to the Constitution, you need 3/4 of the states to agree this would be a proper change. 34 out of 50 states. And notice something I said before, those small states like Wyoming and Alaska, they get a kind of a bit of a punch from the Electoral College the way that it stands, because their Electoral College votes are a little more than what they are as a share of the population. Would those states vote to get rid of the Electoral College? Not very likely. And there's probably more than 1/4 of them that would block such a change. News for you, if you like the Electoral College and you think it's a good idea, it's very likely to stay a feature of American politics. If you've been wanting to see the Electoral College changed or removed, some people have said what we need to do is not maybe change the Constitution, but get rid of that unit rule in which states say we're going to award all the votes to one candidate. That would be a way of changing the way it works. That just requires changes in state voting laws. That's a way to address that. That may be the most significant way we'd have change. Other than that, if that's not going to change, we have what we have. And analyzing these patterns is probably the way to really think about what's going to happen some weeks from now on the first Tuesday in November. I hope you do go out and vote, regardless of your persuasions, and think about what you can do to help the process of voting. All right. Thank you for attending. And if you do have some further questions for me, I'll be here for a few minutes afterward. Thank you for attending. We'll talk about lobbying next week.